He thought the trap would catch dinner, not a terrified alien girl. Her fear wasn't of death, it was something far more intimate. Now he's navigating cultural boundaries he never knew existed, with both their lives hanging in the balance. He wasn't hunting sentient beings. The trap was meant for the six-legged grazers that moved through the canyon at dusk, creatures that would keep him fed for another week. He'd fashioned the snare from scavenged wiring, and a tension spring pulled from his wrecked shuttle's landing gear. Simple mechanics, really. Pressure plate, concealed noose, quick-release mechanism. It should have caught something with hooves and a dull nervous system. The snap echoed through the twilight canyon, sharper than he expected. Not the thrashing struggle of an animal caught by the leg. This was different. A single sharp sound followed by absolute silence. That silence felt heavier than any noise. It pressed against his ears as he moved toward the trap site. He found her tangled in the wires. Not an animal. Her limbs were all wrong, too slender, too deliberately arranged. Her eyes locked onto his, wide and dark with a terror that went beyond physical pain. As he approached, her skin began to glow. Not a uniform light, but patterns that shifted across her arms and torso like liquid panic. Swirls of blue and violet pulsed in rhythmic waves he couldn't decipher. Every step he took made the patterns intensify. When he raised his hands to show he meant no harm, the light flashed bright enough to make him blink. She wasn't trying to escape the wires. She held herself perfectly still as if movement would make things worse. Her gaze kept darting from his face to the snare's configuration, then back to his eyes. He realized the trap held her in a specific way. The wires crossed her body in precise lines, over one shoulder, under the opposite arm, around the waist. She wasn't just caught. She was positioned. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a prey animal. This was someone. The snare wasn't for her, but now it held them both captive. He couldn't release her without touching her, and every movement he made seemed to violate some unspoken rule. She watched him with that terrified intensity, her skin still flashing those incomprehensible patterns. The canyon air grew cold around them. He stood there weighing his options. Cut the wires and risk terrifying her further. Leave her trapped and let the night predators come. Try to communicate without making things worse. The trap he'd set for dinner had caught something far more complicated, and now he was just as ensnared by the situation as she was by his wiring. What kind of trap was this, really? It was supposed to be simple survival technology, but the way she looked at it, the way she looked at him, suggested it meant something else entirely. Something he hadn't intended. The wires held her in a pattern that clearly signified more than just restraint, and he was suddenly very aware that he'd stepped into a situation with rules he didn't understand. He'd seen fear before. Animals panicked when trapped. They thrashed, bit, jerked against restraints. Universal stuff. But her reaction was something else entirely. She wasn't fighting the wires. She held herself rigid, perfectly still, as if movement itself was the danger. Her hands kept covering specific spots, not vital areas he'd protect in a fight, not throat or eyes. Instead, she shielded the inside of her wrists, the curve where her neck met shoulder, the delicate skin just above her hip bones. Precise, almost ceremonial placements. The gestures seemed practiced, ritualistic. This wasn't just about protecting vulnerable anatomy. He noticed she flinched when he looked directly at her. More than when he'd drawn his knife earlier to cut the wires, his gaze seemed to hurt her in a way steel couldn't. Those light patterns on her skin pulsed faster when he made eye contact, swirling into tight, frantic spirals. Every attempt to calm her made it worse. He tried showing empty hands. She curled tighter into herself. He spoke in low, gentle tones. The patterns on her skin flashed crimson. He stepped back to give space. She actually whimpered, a sound that cut through the twilight air. Nothing worked. All his standard de-escalation tactics were just escalating the situation. Her body language screamed shame, not survival instinct. The way she kept her head bowed, the slight tremble in her limbs, the way she seemed to be apologizing to the empty air around them. This wasn't fear of pain or death. This was deeper, more intimate. He realized she was performing some kind of cultural script. Every gesture, every flinch, every pattern on her skin was communicating something specific. Something about violation, about boundaries crossed. Her fear wasn't about the physical danger he represented. It was about what he represented. The wires themselves seemed to be part of the problem. The way they crossed her body, over one shoulder under the opposite arm, apparently meant something in her culture. She kept glancing at the pattern they made against her skin as if reading some terrible message written in metal. He finally understood this wasn't about him being a predator in the food chain sense. This was about him being the wrong kind of predator. The kind that doesn't just take your life but takes something more personal. Something about his presence, his looking at her, his proximity. All of it was violating rules he couldn't see. Her fear was cultural, not physical. She was reacting to invisible boundaries he'd crossed without knowing they existed. The trap was bad enough, but his attempts to fix it were making everything worse because he didn't understand what the problem actually was. How does fear work when it's not about survival, but about social violation? When every glance is an intrusion, every gesture an offense, he was speaking the wrong language entirely, and every word he didn't say was somehow louder than the ones he did. He thought she feared being eaten, that basic survival terror, teeth, blood, consumption, something primal and universal, but her reaction was wrong. She wasn't looking at his weapons or his mouth. Her attention stayed fixed on the wires, on the way they crossed her body, on the empty space between them. Her terror wasn't about becoming food. It was about becoming something else entirely. When he moved closer, she didn't shrink back like prey. She went rigid like someone facing a violation. Her skin patterns swirled into tight, intricate designs that looked less like fear and more like ceremony. Like she was participating in some awful ritual. The snare's configuration clearly meant something specific. The way the main line ran diagonally across her torso, the secondary wrap around her upper arm, the particular knot resting against her hip. She kept studying these details with a kind of horrified fascination. As if reading her own fate written in wire, she thought this was intentional, deliberate. The careful placement, the specific bindings, all of it pointed to calculation, not accident. In her mind, he hadn't stumbled upon her. He had chosen her, designed this moment, prepared this exact configuration to communicate something terrible. He was playing a role in her cultural nightmare. Some script she recognized immediately. The hunter, the trap, the specific way she was restrained. It all added up to something in her society. Something that made her fear him in a way that had nothing to do with physical harm. Her eyes kept darting between his face and the bindings. Not checking for weapons, checking for recognition. She expected him to understand what this meant. When he showed confusion instead of purpose, it seemed to confuse her more. The patterns on her skin flickered between terror and confusion. The intimacy of it chilled him. This wasn't about killing. It was about claiming. The wires weren't just restraints, they were symbols. The way they crossed her body marked territory, defined relationships, created bonds. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of connection, of being tied to him in some cultural sense she understood and he didn't. He realized the trap resembled something from her society's rituals. Probably something between hunters and, what mates, rivals, captives. The distinction mattered less than the fact that it meant something. Had rules, had consequences beyond the physical. Why intimacy rather than death? Because some violations cut deeper than flesh. Some boundaries, when crossed, can't be uncrossed. In her culture, this configuration of wires might mean ownership, or marriage, or permanent social alteration, things that can't be solved with a knife cut or an apology. Her fear was about identity theft, not life theft, about being remade into something she didn't choose, becoming his in a way that would strip her of her own people, her own place, her own name. The wires were just the physical manifestation of a social trap she understood all too well. He stood there realizing his simple survival tool had become a cultural weapon, and he was holding the handle without knowing what it was designed to strike. He reached for the wires, just to cut her free. Simple solution. Her reaction stopped him cold. A sharp intake of breath, skin flashing from panicked blue to a deep warning crimson. Not fear of the blade, fear of his hands on the bindings themselves. Touching the wires was part of the violation. He saw it in her eyes. The specific way he'd have to reach across her body to access the main knot. The angle of his arm. The proximity. All of it was wrong. A script he was following without knowing the lines. The pattern mattered. The primary wire crossed her torso from right shoulder to left hip. A secondary loop cinched around her upper left arm. The main restraint knot rested precisely over her lower ribs. These weren't random placements. They were positions. Meaningful geometry. Her culture apparently read restraint like a language, and he'd just written a sentence without knowing the words. He was reenacting a courtship ritual, a brutal one. In her society, hunters didn't court with words or gifts. They demonstrated skill. They designed traps. Catching someone in a snare was a proposal, a claim. The complexity of the design showed intent. The placement of the bindings showed desire. The whole violent poetry of it was a statement. I want you. I can take you. You are mine. She thought this was intentional abduction for mating. The careful construction, the specific configuration, it all pointed to deliberation. To weeks of planning. To a hunter who had studied her patterns, learned her paths, and crafted this exact moment to claim her. Her terror wasn't about pain. It was about permanence. The trap's design mirrored their binding ceremonies. He'd used a tension release mechanism with a particular double loop closure. Pure engineering to him. To her, it probably signaled high status. A hunter who could work complex mechanics. The materials, scavenged ship-grade wiring, might signify wealth or off-world connection. Every accidental detail made him look more like a calculated suitor. He wasn't a hunter to her. He was a suitor. The worst kind. One who bypassed consent with clever knots and strong wire. One who used demonstration of force as a substitute for conversation. In her eyes, he had just announced to the universe that she belonged to him, using a cultural shorthand he didn't understand. The taboos he'd triggered were about ownership and choice. The wire across the torso claimed the body. The loop around the arm claimed strength and labor. The knot at the ribs claimed breath and life. He hadn't just caught her. He'd cataloged her, valued her, made a public statement about her worth to him, all without saying a word. She was trapped in more than wire. She was trapped in a social contract, one her people would recognize instantly, one that might be impossible to break. Her fear was the fear of a signed document she never got to read, a binding agreement written in metal and poor decisions. He pulled his hand back from the wires. The damage was already done. The statement had been made. Now he had to figure out how to unsay it, how to tell a person who reads traps like poetry that this was just bad grammar, a mistake in translation, a survival tool that wrote a love letter in a language he didn't speak. He tried the universal peace gestures first. Open hands, palms forward. Standard first contact stuff. Her reaction was immediate and wrong. Her skin patterns flashed a deep, pulsating orange. The open hands weren't a sign of peace. They were a mating display in her culture. An invitation. A promise. He stepped back to give her space. Another mistake. In her society, retreat wasn't respect. It was part of the courtship dance. The hunter steps back to show he's giving the prey a fighting chance. A challenge. Her breathing hitched. The patterns on her skin tightened into defensive spirals. Maintaining eye contact felt like the right move. Show he wasn't looking away in shame. Wrong again. Direct gaze was a challenge ritual. A declaration of intent. The longer he looked, the more certain she became that this was deliberate. That he was following their brutal courting script perfectly. Even his breathing betrayed him. He took slow, measured breaths to appear calm. To her, the controlled rhythm signaled focused aggression. Predator breathing. The kind you hear before a pounce. Her own breathing became shallow, rapid. A prey response. They were having two different conversations with the same air. The environment itself seemed to accuse him. The fading light made the wires gleam like ceremonial metal. The canyon walls echoed his movements back at them. Every rustle of his clothing sounded like intentional noise. His technology was all wrong. Human design, alien meanings. His posture, relaxed shoulders, balanced stance, might signal readiness for combat in her culture. His very presence was a violation. The way he occupied space, the scent of his skin, the sound of his heartbeat, all of it communicated things he couldn't control, things he didn't understand. He was a walking collection of offensive gestures, every physiological function a potential insult. He tried speaking, low tones, gentle words, universal basic phrases. Her skin patterns flickered in response to the cadence, not the meaning. The rising inflection at the end of sentences might signal aggression. The consonant sounds could resemble mating calls. There was no neutral ground, no safe communication. He realized words were useless. Every gesture carried cultural weight. Every movement was a sentence in a language he didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of misinterpretation. a minefield of unintended meanings. He stopped trying to communicate, stopped moving, stopped trying to fix it with human solutions. He just watched, observed the patterns on her skin, noticed how they changed with his stillness. The frantic swirling slowed slightly. The color softened from panic orange to a wary blue. He watched her breathing, saw how it syncopated with his own. When he held his breath for a moment, hers evened out. Small things, tiny calibrations. He realized communication wasn't about what he said. It was about what he didn't do. The spaces between actions, the silence between breaths. How do you talk to someone when every word is a landmine? You don't. You listen. You watch. You learn their language of silence. You become a student of the space between gestures. You understand that sometimes the most powerful communication happens when you stop trying to speak. Night came down hard on the canyon. The temperature dropped fast. He could already hear the nocturnal hunters stirring in the shadows. Their calls echoed off the stone walls, low guttural clicks and scraping sounds. They needed to move. His shelter was half a click away, reinforced against the local predators. But moving meant touching her. Meant crossing boundaries he couldn't see. The trap's materials were failing. The scavenged wiring was stretching under her slight weight. The tension spring had developed a worrisome shiver. Soon it wouldn't hold anything. If it snapped while they were still here, she'd be free but terrified, likely to run straight into the hunting packs. If he cut her loose now, she might bolt into greater danger. If he left her bound, they'd both be night meat. Her fear was the real trap now. The cultural misunderstanding had them both pinned. She saw every movement as part of a brutal courtship ritual. He saw survival necessities. They were speaking different languages with the same gestures, and the translation errors could get them killed. He watched her patterns, noticed how they changed when he shifted his weight, when he looked at the approaching darkness instead of at her, when he showed concern for the environment rather than just for her. Small calibrations, tiny adjustments. He needed to break the cycle. Couldn't use human solutions. Couldn't use her cultural solutions either. Had to invent something new, something that proved he didn't understand what he'd done, that this was all accident. He stepped back farther than before, beyond what could be mistaken for courtship retreat, put real distance between them. Then he turned his back. Deliberate vulnerability, showing her the canyon, the darkness, the actual threat. Not her, never her. He pointed toward the hunting sounds, made a cutting motion across his throat, universal danger signal, then pointed to his shelter's direction. Then back to the predators, simple cause and effect. We stay, we die. He didn't look at her while he did it, kept his attention on the real threat, showed that his concern was survival, not possession, that the wires were about practicality, not poetry. Her skin patterns shifted. The frantic spiral slowed. The panic blue faded to a watchful silver. She was still afraid, but now it was directed outward, at the actual danger, not at him. He approached the wires again, but differently. Didn't reach for the knots. Instead, he took his knife and cut the tension line from a distance, the part that wasn't touching her. The trap went slack. The wires loosened but didn't fall away. She could free herself if she chose. He stepped back again, turned to face the hunting sounds, put his body between her and the darkness, didn't watch her, didn't check if she was escaping, showed that her freedom was her choice, that his priority was the real threat. He heard the wires slip to the ground, heard her stand. He didn't turn, just waited. Either she'd run into the night or she'd understand. Either way, he'd broken the cycle. Proved he didn't know the rules he'd apparently broken. Her hand touched his shoulder. Light, brief. Then she was beside him, looking toward the predators. Not at him. At the shared danger. Her skin showed calm, steady patterns now. Recognition, understanding. Survival depended on not crossing lines. So he'd stepped back from all of them. Created new ground between their cultures. A space where accidents could be forgiven. Where survival mattered more than ritual. Where two different kinds of fear could face the same darkness together. He began studying the trap from her perspective. Not as survival equipment, as communication. The specific knots, a modified constrictor hitch with a quick release toggle. The wire placement, diagonal across the torso, secondary loop around the upper arm. The tension mechanism, salvaged shuttle spring with precision calibration. All of it meant something. In her culture, hunters didn't court with words. They demonstrated skill. Catching someone in a snare was a marriage proposal. The complexity showed dedication. The design showed creativity. The placement showed intention. Every element communicated value, worth, desire. His accidental design was particularly elaborate. The constrictor hitch was a complex knot rarely used in basic trapping. The diagonal torso wrap required precise measurement. The spring mechanism showed engineering skill. To her eyes, this wasn't some quick survival snare. This was a carefully crafted statement. She thought he'd spent weeks planning this, studying her patterns, learning her paths, choosing materials that would impress. The shuttle-grade wiring might signify off-world resources. The precision spring could indicate technical expertise. Everything about the trap screamed deliberate intention. The more complex the trap, the more honorable the intention in her society. Simple snares were for beginners, crude attempts, but this was masterwork level, the kind of trap only an experienced hunter would construct, the kind that showed real commitment, real investment. His competence as a hunter made him seem more deliberate. He knew how to build effective traps, knew which knots held best, understood tension and release mechanisms. All that practical knowledge now worked against him, made the accident look like calculated artistry. She assumed the worst because the evidence pointed that way. The trap was too good, too precise, too thoughtful. No one accidentally creates something that elaborate. No one stumbles into that level of technical execution. In her cultural context, this was clearly premeditated. The placement mattered. The diagonal wire crossed specific energy points on her body. The loop around the arm indicated which tasks she'd perform. The knot placement suggested how many children they might have. He'd written an entire life together in wire and knots without knowing the language. His accidental excellence became his biggest problem. If the trap had been sloppy, she might have doubted his intentions. But it was perfect. Beautiful, even. The wires lay against her skin in clean, precise lines. The knots were symmetrical. The tension was perfectly balanced. It looked like art, like devotion. She saw weeks of work, nights spent planning, days spent gathering just the right materials. Practice runs to perfect the mechanism, all leading to this moment. This precise capture, this declaration of intent. How could it be anything but deliberate? The truth was both simpler and more complicated. He was just trying to eat, using skills he'd learned in survival training, applying human engineering to alien materials, creating something functional, not meaningful. But function without cultural context becomes something else entirely. Something dangerous. His trap wasn't just a snare. It was a love letter written in a language he didn't speak, and she was reading every perfect, terrifying word. He finally understood by doing everything wrong. After hours of failed communication, of careful gestures that only made things worse, frustration took over. He stopped trying to be delicate, stopped following any protocol, just grabbed the trap and started tearing it apart. This should have been the ultimate violation. In her culture, dismantling a binding ritual was the worst possible insult. It showed disrespect for the tradition, for the intention, for the person bound. She should have reacted with absolute horror, with righteous anger, with final, desperate struggle. But she didn't. She watched him with sudden curiosity instead of fear. Her skin pattern shifted from panic colors to a calm, observant silver. She studied his hands, the way he fumbled with the knots, the clumsy way he just cut through wires that should have been ceremonially unwound. He wasn't following the unbinding patterns. There were specific sequences in her culture. Certain knots had to be released before others. Certain wires had to be handled with ritual care. He was just destroying it, like breaking a machine. No ceremony, no respect, no understanding. His clumsy destruction showed he didn't know the traditions. The precision he'd shown in building the trap was completely absent in taking it apart. He used brute force where finesse was required, cut where he should have untied, pulled where he should have gently loosened. It was the work of someone who saw mechanics, not meaning. She realized this wasn't intentional courtship. No one who understood their rituals would dismantle a binding this way. It would be like insulting your own proposal, defiling your own declaration. The very incompetence that made him seem dangerous now made him seem innocent. The truth dawned on both of them simultaneously. He saw her expression change from terror to comprehension. She saw his frustration turn to realization. They stood there in the growing darkness, the ruined trap between them, understanding finally clicking into place. His incompetence saved them both. The very thing that made him a poor cultural student made him an honest accident. His inability to follow her society's rules became proof that he never knew them. That this was all mistake, all wrong place, wrong time, wrong materials. How did he figure out what she was really afraid of? By stopping trying to figure it out. By letting frustration take over. By doing what came naturally instead of what felt right. By being human in a situation that demanded alien precision. The breakthrough came from destruction, not construction. From tearing down instead of building up. From showing his ignorance instead of hiding it. His clumsy hands spoke louder than any careful gesture could. They said, "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't understand your rules. This is all accident." She reached out and touched the ruined wires, not with fear, with something like wonder. Then she looked at him. Really looked. Not at a predator or a suitor. Just at a man. A confused man who'd trapped her by mistake and then freed her by accident. The patterns on her skin softened to a gentle, understanding blue. The night felt different now. The predators still called in the distance, but the space between them had changed. They weren't hunter and prey, weren't suitor and intended, just two beings in a dark canyon, starting over from misunderstanding. Freedom came with new dangers. She didn't run when the wires fell away. Just stood there studying him. The patterns on her skin shifted to soft analytical waves. She was seeing him properly now. Not as predator or suitor, just as a problem. A complicated one. Now she knew the truth, but the damage was done. By her cultural laws, she was technically bound to him. The trap had been set. She'd been caught. The ritual completed itself through accident. Her people wouldn't care about intentions. Only actions. Only outcomes. Her status was compromised. Any physical intimacy with an outsider was considered highly irregular. The wires had touched her skin. His hands had been near the bindings. In her society's eyes, she was contaminated, exposed to primitive human ways, no longer pure, no longer trusted. His people would see it differently, but just as badly. If anyone found out about this, he'd be labeled a contaminant, someone who'd breached protocol, someone who'd touched what shouldn't be touched, mixed what shouldn't be mixed. Both their cultures had strict rules about these things. Rules they'd just broken by accident. They were both outcasts now. She couldn't return to her people without facing judgment, possibly exile. He couldn't report this without risking disciplinary action. Maybe worse. The trap had caught more than just bodies. It had caught futures, destroyed possibilities, closed doors neither of them knew were open. The canyon felt smaller now. The predators still called in the distance, but the real threat was behind them, in their pasts. In the societies they might never rejoin. The accident had redrawn their lives in permanent ink. No erasing it. No pretending it didn't happen. She made a soft sound. Not words, just acknowledgement. Her skin showed patterns of resignation, acceptance. She understood the price as well as he did. Maybe better. Her culture had clearer rules about these things. Clearer consequences. He looked at the ruined trap. Wires and springs that had been simple survival tools. Now they were evidence. Proof of a violation. Proof of a bond neither of them wanted but both were stuck with. The universe had a nasty sense of humor sometimes. There was no going back to who they were before. He wasn't just a stranded survivor anymore. She wasn't just a random alien. They were linked now. By accident. By cultural misunderstanding. By the simple fact that sometimes things went wrong in ways that couldn't be fixed. The price was their old lives, their places in their own societies, their sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Now they only had each other. Two accidents in a canyon, two people who'd started the day as strangers and ended it as partners in exile. What price did they pay? Everything familiar, everything safe, everything that made sense. They'd lost their contexts, their reference points. The trap hadn't just caught them physically. It had caught their identities. Their pasts, their futures. Now they had to build new ones from scratch, from misunderstanding, from broken wires and cultural accidents, from the realization that sometimes survival means losing everything you were to become something you never planned to be. The night felt colder now, the predators quieter. The real danger wasn't out there in the darkness. It was inside them, the knowledge that they could never go home again. That home had been redefined by a few feet of wire and a bad moment. They stood there together, not touching, not speaking, Just being together in the new reality they'd accidentally created, two people who'd started as hunter and prey, become suitor and intended, ended as exiles. Partners in a disaster neither saw coming. The lights appeared first. Not torchlight. Something else. Cold blue beams that sliced through the canyon darkness. Her people. They moved with that eerie silence he'd come to recognize. Not walking. Gliding. He had seconds to decide. He could have used her as leverage. Grabbed her. Put a blade to her throat. Made demands. Standard hostage protocol. Her people would likely negotiate. Their concern for her was obvious in how they moved. Careful. Precise. Not like hunters. Like rescuers. He could have used her as protection. Stood behind her. Made her his shield. They wouldn't risk harming her. He could have backed away slowly. Bought time. Found an escape route. Survival logic said use every advantage. Every asset, he did neither. He stepped between her and the lights. Put his body in the line of fire. Left himself exposed. Made himself the target. Defied every survival instinct he'd ever learned. He refused to let them see her in compromised positions. The wires were gone, but the memory remained. The way they'd crossed her body. The specific placements. He positioned himself to block their view of her. Took stances that covered the spots where the bindings had been. Protected her privacy even when it meant exposing himself. When one of them gestured toward her, he shifted to block the line of sight. When they tried to circle around, he moved to maintain cover. It was a dance. A protective dance. Every movement said, you see me, not her. You deal with me, not her. These gestures spoke louder than any words could. He wasn't speaking their language. Wasn't using peace signs or universal gestures. Just using his body as a barrier. As a statement. Her dignity mattered more than his safety. She watched from behind him. Her skin showed patterns he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger. Something like recognition. Something like respect. She saw that his honor wasn't in hunting, but in protecting. Not in taking, but in shielding. He valued her dignity more than his own life. The thought wasn't conscious. Wasn't calculated, just was. An instinct deeper than survival. The understanding that some lines shouldn't be crossed even to stay alive. That how you survive matters as much as that you survive. How did protecting her dignity become more important? Because survival without honor is just breathing. Because some things define you more than staying alive. Because in that canyon, with those blue lights carving through the darkness, he understood that how they saw her mattered more than how they saw him. He stood there, unarmed, between an alien girl and her own people, making himself the target, making himself the problem, giving her space to be who she was without the shame of what had happened. Without the memory of wires and mistaken intentions, the lights focused on him. The figures advanced. He didn't reach for weapons. Didn't make threatening moves. Just held his ground. Protected her space. Protected her story. Let them see only what he chose to show them. Which was himself. All the risk. All the danger. All the consequences. She made a soft sound behind him. Not fear, not warning. Just a note. An acknowledgement. Her people paused. The lights held steady on him. Nobody moved. The canyon held its breath. He stood there exposed between two worlds, protecting one person's dignity at the cost of everything else, knowing that sometimes the most important survival isn't your own. Sometimes it's protecting what makes survival worth having in the first place. The figures finally moved, not toward him, not toward her, just a shift in formation, a change in stance. The lights lowered slightly. The threat level dropped. They were reading his body language, reading his intentions. Reading the protection he offered rather than the danger he represented. He didn't know if it would work. Didn't know if they understood. Just knew he'd made the right choice. The only choice that let him look at himself in the morning. Survival mattered, but how you survived mattered more. Her people saw his protective stance and hesitated. The blue lights held steady on him, but the advance stopped. They recognized behavior that contradicted their assumptions. This human wasn't acting like a predator. Wasn't acting like a suitor. Was acting like a guardian, something their culture understood deeply. She spoke to them in their own language. The sounds were melodic, layered, completely alien. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Explanation, not defense. Calm narration, not panic. Her skin patterns shifted to match her speech, flowing in gentle waves of blue and silver. She was telling the truth. The whole accidental story. They studied the trap's remains, the cut wires, the shattered spring mechanism, the clumsy knots. They saw the crude construction now. Human engineering, not ceremonial art. Practical solutions, not symbolic statements. The materials were all wrong, too. Scavenged ship parts, not traditional binding metals. This wasn't a masterwork proposal. This was a survival tool. They recognized accidental pattern similarity. The diagonal torso wrap that meant claiming in their culture was just efficient trapping technique in his. The arm loop that signaled labor division was just additional security. The whole configuration was parallel development, not cultural theft. Different paths reaching similar solutions for different reasons. His willingness to die for her honor changed everything. They'd seen him stand between her and danger, seen him protect her privacy, seen him value her dignity over his own survival. These were concepts they understood. These were values they shared. The disaster became diplomatic opportunity. Two species found common ground through misunderstanding. The very thing that nearly killed them became their bridge. They began communicating through gesture and example, showing how human trapping techniques worked, demonstrating the mechanics versus the ceremony, building understanding from broken pieces. The alliance formed from mutual respect earned through crisis. Her people saw that humans valued honor. He saw that her people valued protection. They found common ground in the space between their mistakes, created new protocols from old accidents. They established a convergence point right there in the canyon. No formal ceremonies, no diplomatic procedures, just two groups who'd almost fought now working together. Her people helped reinforce his shelter against the nocturnal predators. He showed them human survival techniques that might be useful. The unexpected alliance was between practical need and cultural understanding. Between accident and intention. Between two species who'd started as hunter and prey and ended as partners. The cultural disaster became their first joint project, something to solve together rather than fight over. What unexpected alliance formed? One built on demonstrated character rather than stated intentions. One forged in the heat of misunderstanding and cooled in the reality of shared values. They didn't need translation devices or cultural manuals. They had the evidence of actions, the proof of choices made under pressure. The blue lights eventually dimmed. The weapons were lowered. The tense formations relaxed. They stood together in the canyon, human and alien, looking at the same stars from different perspectives but with newfound respect. The predators still called in the distance, but now they called to a united front. Two species who should have been enemies became collaborators. All because one man valued a stranger's dignity over his own life. All because one woman recognized truth in accidental actions. The alliance wasn't in any diplomatic record, wasn't in any official treaty, was in the shared space between them where understanding grew from the wreckage of misunderstanding. The night felt different now. The darkness felt less threatening. The canyon walls seemed closer, but in a protective way. They had work to do, plans to make, a new relationship to build. But for the first time since the trap snapped shut, they were moving forward together instead of struggling against each other. He learned how close he came to actual death. Not from predators, not from exposure, from her. The realization hit him hours later when they finally established basic communication. Her fear hadn't been about mating, hadn't been about intimacy, had been about killing or being killed. In her culture, refusal of a binding proposal meant combat. The trapped person had to either accept or defeat the hunter. No middle ground. No negotiation. The fight was to the death, always. The trap wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. A declaration of war dressed up as courtship. She had been preparing to fight him to the death. Those protective gestures weren't just about shame. They were combat stances. The way she covered specific points, wrist, neck, hip. Those were vital strike zones in their martial traditions. The patterns on her skin weren't just fear displays. They were battle preparations, energy channeling, combat readiness. The intimacy she feared was the violent kind, not physical connection, not emotional bonding. The intimacy of blades crossing, of bodies straining against each other, of life and death decisions made in close quarters. Their courtship rituals were battle rituals. Love and war used the same vocabulary. He'd accidentally challenged her to mortal combat. His survival snare was a dueling invitation in her culture. The complexity of the trap showed the seriousness of the challenge. The materials indicated the stakes. The placement of the bindings defined the combat terms. He'd written a death warrant in wire and knots. How do alien courtship rituals create life-threatening misunderstandings? By using the same actions for love and war. By making survival and mating two sides of the same coin. By creating systems where a simple mistake can mean someone dies. Where cultural assumptions turn practical tools into deadly weapons. Her people confirmed it later. They showed him the ceremonial traps used in their bonding challenges. The similarities were chilling. Same diagonal torso wrap, same arm loop, same precision knotwork. His survival engineering had accidentally replicated their deadliest traditions. He'd essentially handed her a loaded weapon and asked her to play a game he didn't know the rules to. The crisis was real. She'd been moments from attacking him. Those patterns on her skin had been building combat energy. Those protective gestures had been blocking strikes. That intense focus had been targeting vital points. He'd been standing there trying to be gentle while she prepared to fight for her life. The only thing that saved him was his ignorance. His clumsy attempts to free her showed he didn't understand the challenge. His frustration proved he wasn't following the ritual. His protection of her dignity demonstrated values outside their combat traditions. She realized this wasn't a duel, wasn't a courtship, was just a terrible mistake, but the danger had been real. The potential for violence was baked into their cultural DNA. Two different interpretations of the same physical actions. His practical survival, her ceremonial combat. Both valid, both deadly when they collided. Alien courtship rituals create life-threatening misunderstandings because they assume intention where there might be accident. Because they read meaning into mechanics. Because sometimes a trap is just a trap, sometimes a snare is just for dinner. But when cultures collide, the simplest actions can have the most complicated, dangerous consequences. He had to demonstrate what he couldn't say. With her people watching, he needed to prove his intentions weren't violent or ceremonial. Any wrong move could restart the conflict. One misplaced gesture, one wrong expression, and they'd be back to square one with weapons drawn. He reconstructed the trap step by step. Used the same materials, same techniques, showed how simple it was, how utilitarian. No ceremony, no symbolism, just function. Pressure plate here, tension spring there, release mechanism over there. He made sure they saw the crude workmanship, the practical solutions, the lack of artistic intent. Then he demonstrated its intended function. Waited for one of the small six-legged grazers to approach. Let the trap snap shut on the creature's leg. Perfect capture. Exactly as designed. He showed them how to release it unharmed. How the mechanism worked for feeding, not fighting. Not claiming. Not courting. He showed how different it was from their ceremonial designs. Pointed out the differences. His used scavenged materials, not traditional metals. His knots were practical, not symbolic. His placements were about efficiency, not meaning. He made them see the gap between survival engineering and cultural art. But the most powerful proof was what he didn't do. He never touched her without permission. Never made demanding gestures. Never stood too close. Never held eye contact too long. His restraint became his most eloquent argument. His silence spoke louder than any explanation could. He kept his movements slow and predictable. Made sure they could always see his hands. Never turned his back suddenly. Never reached for anything without announcing it first. He became a study in control, in respect, in understanding that sometimes the best communication is not communicating at all. What desperate measures did he take? The measure of constant vigilance, of thinking through every gesture before making it, of treating every moment like a potential misunderstanding waiting to happen. He became hyper-aware of his own body, his own presence, his own potential to offend without meaning to. He used the environment as his co-conspirator. Let the natural world demonstrate what he couldn't explain, showed how the trap worked on local fauna, how the mechanisms responded to weight and pressure, not ceremony and tradition. Let reality do the talking when words failed. He made himself vulnerable on purpose. Stood where they could easily reach him. Left his weapons visibly stored away. Showed empty hands constantly. Made it clear the trust went both ways. That he was risking as much as they were by being there. The proof wasn't in the demonstration. Wasn't in the reconstructed trap. Was in the space between actions. In the respect he showed by not assuming understanding. By not forcing communication. By letting them take their time. By accepting that some truths need to be discovered, not explained. His careful restraint built a bridge where words had failed. His respect for their space became a language they understood. His willingness to be patient, to be careful, to be constantly aware of their reactions, that was the real proof of harmlessness. Not what he did, but what he didn't do. Not what he said, but what he didn't say. They watched him, studied him, saw the consistency of his actions, the pattern of respect, the absence of threat. Slowly, their postures relaxed. Their lights dimmed. Their attention shifted from defensive to curious. The crisis passed not because he explained himself well, but because he proved himself through constant, careful action. They stood together between two cultures, neither able to fully return to their old lives. He had seen too much of Nixon ways to be considered neutral by his people. She had been touched by human ways too deeply to fit back into her society's rigid protocols. The accident had marked them both, crossing lines that weren't meant to be crossed. He wasn't just a stranded survivor anymore. He was a contaminant, someone who'd breached interstellar contact guidelines, someone who'd gotten too close, learned too much, touched what shouldn't be touched. Reporting this would mean disciplinary hearings, possibly permanent grounding. His career in space exploration was over the moment that trap snapped shut. She faced different consequences. Her unauthorized mission to study humans had already violated Nixon's scientific protocols. The physical contact, the cultural contamination, the entire incident, it all added up to exile. Her people saw humans as dangerous predators. Getting this close to one, especially in this context, meant she could never be trusted again. But they had created something new. A category that didn't exist before. Bridge between worlds. Translator of misunderstandings. Living proof that accidents could become opportunities. Their cabin in the canyon became neutral ground. A place where both species could meet without formal protocols getting in the way. The accident forced evolution in both societies. Human first contact protocols had always assumed deliberate, controlled encounters. They never accounted for accidents. Never planned for cultural misunderstandings. His experience proved that sometimes the best connections happen when everything goes wrong. Nixon science had to adapt too. Their rigid research methods couldn't explain what happened here. Couldn't categorize this relationship. Couldn't file it away in neat scientific boxes. They had to create new classifications, new ways of understanding interspecies contact that included emotion, accident, and personal connection. First contact protocols were rewritten because of their mistake. Human and Nixon diplomats used their experience as a case study, created new guidelines for accidental encounters, established procedures for cultural misunderstandings. Their disaster became the textbook example of how to turn crisis into connection. The payoff was deeper than he expected. He'd thought first contact was about language, technology, formal introductions. Turns out it's about reading panic patterns, about understanding that fear isn't always about survival, about recognizing that cultural assumptions can be more dangerous than any weapon. He learned that sometimes errors create better paths than planning. That perfection isn't required for connection, that the messy, uncomfortable, dangerous space between cultures is where real understanding grows. That the universe rewards courage more than caution. His view of first contact shifted from scientific to human, from protocol to people, from what should happen to what actually happens when beings meet without rules. He saw that the most important translations aren't between languages, but between fears, between hopes, between what we're afraid to lose and what we're willing to gain. The canyon became their classroom, the trap their textbook, the misunderstanding their lesson plan. They stood there together, Human and Nixon, looking at the stars they'd both come from, understanding that home wasn't a place anymore. Home was this new space they'd created between accident and intention, between fear and trust. He thought he was just setting a simple trap, a basic snare for local wildlife to secure his next meal. The materials were scavenged from his crashed shuttle, standard wiring, a tension spring, some metal fragments. Nothing special, nothing symbolic, just survival engineering. But nothing is simple between different worlds. The materials he used had symbolic meanings he couldn't see. The specific alloy composition in the wires resembled ceremonial metals in her culture. The spring's coil pattern mirrored traditional art forms. The knots he used, practical constrictor hitches, looked like binding symbols from her society's rituals. The location he chose had ritual significance. That particular canyon intersection was where her people conducted coming-of-age ceremonies. The specific rock formation where he anchored the trap was considered sacred ground. The angle of the setting relative to the sunset had ceremonial importance during mating seasons. Even the time of day carried cultural weight. Dusk was when her people performed bonding rituals. The fading light, the specific quality of shadow, the angle of the dying sun, all of it signaled intentional ceremony rather than accidental trapping. He was playing with forces he didn't understand. The universe is filled with invisible cultural landmines. Things that look like simple physics in one culture become profound statements in another. A knot is never just a knot. A wire is never just a wire. A trap is never just a trap when cultures collide without translation. He triggered multiple taboos by accident. The diagonal torso wrap symbolized claiming ownership of a mate. The arm loop indicated which domestic duties she'd perform. The specific knot placement suggested how many children they'd have. The materials indicated his social status. The location suggested ceremony witnesses. The timing indicated romantic intention. Every detail he considered practical became symbolic. The wire tension showed his seriousness. The trap's sensitivity demonstrated his skill level. The fact it caught her proved his worth as a hunter. In her cultural context, he'd just delivered a perfectly crafted marriage proposal using a language he didn't speak. Survival isn't just about physics. It's about context. He focused on the mechanics of staying alive while completely missing the cultural implications of how he was doing it. His perfect survival trap became the worst possible cultural violation because he understood materials but not meanings. The cultural taboos stacked up. Physical contact with an outsider, participation in binding rituals without proper initiation, violation of sacred spaces, misuse of symbolic materials. Every element of his simple snare became another line crossed, another rule broken, another invisible boundary violated. He learned that survival tools carry cultural baggage, that every action communicates something whether you intend it or not, that the universe doesn't care about your intentions, only about how your actions are interpreted through other cultural lenses. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is something simple without understanding what it means to someone else. The weight of unintended consequences settled on him later. How close he came to causing a diplomatic incident. How easily a survival action became a cultural catastrophe. How many invisible rules he'd broken without knowing they existed. The trap hadn't just caught an alien girl. It had caught him in a web of cultural assumptions he never saw coming. He stood there looking at the cut wires, understanding that survival was never just about food and shelter. It was about context, about reading the invisible cultural landscape, about recognizing that every action carries meanings you can't predict, especially between stars. The simplest trap could become the most complicated situation when cultures collide without a translator. As they found ways to communicate, deeper truths began to surface between them. Her terror wasn't about him personally, wasn't about his species or his appearance, was about what he represented, the end of everything she knew. She feared losing her cultural identity more than death itself. In her value system, being bound to an outsider meant eternal separation from her people. Not just exile, complete erasure. She would become nothing, not of her world, not of his. A ghost between cultures, a person without context or meaning. This was worse than death. Death had honor. Death had closure. This was lingering dissolution. Slow fading from existence while still breathing. Losing her place in the universe's story, becoming a footnote in someone else's narrative. The intimacy she feared was cultural annihilation, not physical violation, not emotional connection, the death of her identity, the unraveling of everything that made her who she was. The wires hadn't just caught her body. They threatened to catch her soul and remake it into something unrecognizable. Becoming something neither side would recognize terrified her most. Not human. Not Nixon, some hybrid thing that belonged nowhere, a contamination that both cultures would reject, a living reminder of boundaries crossed and rules broken. Some fears are larger than individual survival. The fear of losing your people, your history, your place in the universe. The fear of being the last of your kind even while others still live. The fear of becoming a stranger to yourself. What did she think he was going to do to her? Not eat her, not hurt her. Not even touch her in any physical way. She thought he would remake her. Strip away her Nixon identity and leave her hollow. fill that emptiness with human ways until nothing of her remained. She saw him as a cultural predator, not hunting her body but her soul, not seeking to consume her but to overwrite her, to make her his in the most fundamental way possible, by making her like him, by erasing everything that made her different. Her fear was about assimilation, not aggression, about losing her distinctiveness, her uniqueness, her cultural DNA. She thought the trap was the first step in a process that would end with her becoming human in everything but biology, a copy of him, a reflection without its own light. The patterns on her skin hadn't been panic. They'd been mourning, grieving for the self she thought she was losing, for the identity she believed was being stolen wire by wire, gesture by gesture. Every movement he made seemed to confirm her worst fears about cultural contamination. She'd been taught humans were dangerous predators, but not in the physical sense. They were cultural carnivores, species that consumed other ways of being and made them their own, that saw difference as something to be eliminated rather than understood. When he finally understood this, everything shifted. Her fear wasn't about him, wasn't about now, was about forever, about eternity spent between worlds belonging to neither, understood by none, a fate more terrifying than any physical pain, more final than any death. The real trap wasn't the wires, wasn't the knots, was the cultural misunderstanding that could turn survival into annihilation, rescue into destruction, help into harm. They stood there together, realizing that sometimes the most dangerous borders aren't between planets but between meanings. They built understanding from total confusion. No protocols existed for this. No rulebooks covered what happens when your survival trap accidentally becomes a marriage proposal in an alien culture. Every moment required invention. Every gesture carried risk. They were writing the manual as they went. They developed new signals. A slow blink meant safety. A palm held sideways meant stop. A specific hum frequency from his damaged comm unit meant danger approaching. They created gestures that had no meaning in either culture, so they couldn't be misinterpreted. A tap on the left shoulder meant, "I understand." A tap on the right meant, "Explain again." They forged a hybrid language of necessity. Part human gesture, part Nixon light patterns, part shared experience. The mistakes became their vocabulary. That first terrible moment when he'd tried to show empty hands became their sign for cultural misunderstanding. The pattern her skin made when she realized he wasn't a predator became their word for trust. Where experts would have failed, they succeeded through ignorance. Diplomats would have followed protocols that didn't apply. Scientists would have tried to categorize what couldn't be categorized. Their lack of knowledge became their advantage. They had no expectations to violate, no rules to break. Sometimes not knowing the rules is the only way to make new ones. They created a communication system based on what worked, not what should work, tested every signal against real situations, refined through trial and error, built a language that was perfectly adapted to their specific needs, their specific relationship. They became natives of a culture that didn't exist yesterday, shared references, private jokes, ways of communicating that only made sense to them. The canyon became their country. The broken trap, their founding document. Their hybrid language, their constitution. How do you communicate when every gesture could be misunderstood? You start from zero. You assume nothing. You test everything. You pay attention to what actually works, not what should work. You let the other person teach you how to speak to them. They developed a system of checks and balances. After every communication, they'd verify. He'd repeat the gesture. She'd confirm with a light pattern. They built in redundancy, created ways to ask, "Did you mean what I think you meant?" without words. The process was slow, exhausting, but it built something stronger than any pre-existing language could have. They weren't just learning to communicate. They were learning each other, building trust gesture by gesture, mistake by mistake. Their hybrid language became living thing. It grew as they did, adapted to new situations, developed nuance, started simple with survival needs, grew to include emotions, complex ideas, even humor. They could make each other laugh with a specific combination of light patterns and hand gestures. The silence between them changed. Went from dangerous to comfortable. They learned to communicate in pauses, in shared looks, in the space between words where real understanding lives. The canyon nights became their classroom, the stars their only witnesses. They proved that communication isn't about speaking the same language. It's about building one together. about being willing to look foolish, to make mistakes, to try again, to understand that sometimes the most powerful connection happens in the space between what's said and what's understood. Two beings from different worlds, creating a new world between them. One gesture at a time, one misunderstanding at a time, one hard-won moment of clarity at a time, becoming natives of a country that existed only in the space between their outstretched hands. Who was really trapped became the question. As understanding grew between them, their roles reversed constantly, sometimes within the same breath. The predator-prey dynamic shattered into something more complicated, more fluid, more real. She held knowledge he needed to survive her world. Knew which plants secreted deadly toxins, which rock formations housed burrowing predators, which water sources were safe. Her understanding of atmospheric shifts, seasonal migrations, and tectonic activity became his survival manual. Without her, he was just a human making educated guesses in an alien environment. He held technology that could protect them both. His modified comm unit could detect approaching life forms. His scavenged shuttle parts could create defensive perimeters. His understanding of human engineering let him modify the environment to their advantage. His weapons, crude as they were, offered physical protection neither could survive without. The balance shifted with each new challenge. When night predators approached, his technology gave them warning. When atmospheric storms gathered, her knowledge found them shelter. When her people searched for them, his military training created false trails and strategic diversions. They traded leadership like partners in a dance, each taking the lead when their skills were needed. Sometimes she was the vulnerable one. Her physical strength was less than his. Her familiarity with human technology was limited. She needed his protection against environmental threats his body could withstand better than hers. His shadow became her shelter during solar flares. His hands became her tools when strength was required. Sometimes he was the vulnerable one. His ignorance of cultural taboos constantly put them at risk. His human senses missed subtle environmental cues. His biological needs didn't match the planet's rhythms. She became his translator, his guide, his cultural interpreter in a world where every gesture could mean disaster. The trap had caught them in a dance of mutual dependence. Neither could survive alone now. Their fates were woven together by accident and necessity. The wires that once bound her now connected them in ways neither could escape. They were two halves of a whole survival equation, each holding what the other lacked. True power came from knowing when to be vulnerable. He learned to admit when he didn't understand, to ask for clarification rather than assume, to show weakness rather than bluff strength. She learned to accept help when offered, to trust his instincts about physical danger, to value his perspective even when it contradicted her training. The strongest position was sometimes surrender, letting the other lead, admitting uncertainty, accepting that survival was a team effort requiring both their strengths. Their power came from combination, not domination, from partnership, not control. What happens when survival depends on not crossing invisible cultural lines? You learn to read the spaces between actions, to watch for reactions you don't understand, to treat every moment as potentially significant. You become hyper-aware that your survival depends on respecting boundaries you can't see. They developed a system of checks and balances. Before any action, they'd signal intent. Watch for reactions. Adjust accordingly. They created safety protocols for cultural navigation, established warning signs for potential misunderstandings, built a framework for cooperation that respected both their needs. The balance of power wasn't about who was in charge. It was about who had the right skills for the moment, who could read the situation best, who could provide what was needed when it was needed. Leadership became situational, flexible, responsive to reality rather than hierarchy. They proved that power isn't about control. It's about contribution. About bringing what you have to the table and trusting your partner to bring what they have. About understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and let someone else lead. That survival, like power, is something you build together. The universe holds more secrets than we can imagine. Cultures with invisible rules that only reveal themselves when we break them. Survival out here isn't about strength or firepower. It's about realizing that someone else's deepest fear might be your complete innocence. Every action carries weight you can't anticipate, especially between stars. The real danger isn't the traps we set for others, but the cultural assumptions we carry without knowing. Those invisible boundaries can turn survival into violation, rescue into threat. Next time you encounter fear, look deeper. Ask what story it's really telling. The answer might reshape everything you know about connection, understanding, and what it means to be truly caught.